Chautauqua Lake, from World War I to World War II. At the close of World War I, on January 1, 1919, a new Warner Dam is dedicated to the public, built by the state of New York. It's a Taintergate Dam with a sill elevation of 1,300.6 feet above mean sea level. It has a capacity of flowing 6,000 cubic feet per second through its 3 Tainter gates. However, the downstream channel capacity of the river is now pegged at about 1,720 cubic feet per second, and the people in Faulkner begin to have basement problems. So we never are able to use that capacity of the dam. And if you remember in an earlier presentation, I showed you that above the dam and above the 3rd Street Bridge, the bottom of the Chautauqua River comes up to an elevation of 1,302.5 feet, and it's a stone-lined channel that gives us some problems. I don't know the politics of the creation of the new Warner Dam. I know that the Warner Dam Association was still given the control of the dam, and one of the things that they were to do was to keep navigable elevations in the outlet of the lake. However, we're coming near the end of the steamboat and the hotel period on Chautauqua Lake, and we're beginning to see a new type of economic impact take place, and that's called second homes. And second homes mean Chautauqua County people and people from different parts of the region. At one point during this period of time, you could go to a particular place in the lake and say, these folks are from Corey. These folks are from someplace else. These folks are from Pittsburgh. These folks are from Aliquippa, not just Pittsburgh. And people were attracted and began to build around the shores of the lake. We began to see some interesting land speculations. I mentioned in a previous presentation that Oriental Park was a turn-of-the-century excitement. Bonita was also about that period of time, but that had to do with the railroads running up the east side of the lake. Now we get something called View Code, which on the 1904 map is shown as a swamp. Under today's regulations, it would remain a swamp. But we had an entrepreneur go in there and build some canals. He lotted it out as if there was public water and sewer, and began to sell them off. And at one point, I guess things got so bad that if you bought one, you got a second one free. Whether or not it was as attractive as the first one or not, I don't know. But there was some interesting and extreme land promotion. But individuals began to come up and build around the lake. Then with the loss of the railroad on the west side of the lake, some of the places where the railroad came very close to the lake, as an example at Magnolia, the railroad right-of-way was sold off and cottages were built on it. And later on, when we get to the east side of the lake, we will see that also after World War II. And these are tiny lots. So where do you get your drinking water, and where do you dispose of your waste? And what we have after the creation of Warner Dam is an ability to influence the lake, but we don't do anything with that ability. And we get a tremendous flood in 1918, which is right there at the close of World War I, that created some very impressive problems for some people. As the development takes place, there is no regulation. All health and development considerations that take place up until 1965 are under the jurisdiction of the town health officer. Now, how does a town health officer who delivered you as a child recommend and reprimand you when it comes to regulations as it deals with health considerations? I can tell you of places built on the lake where two 36-inch vitrified tile were put on end and a bathtub put over the top of them, and the sewage from the house went into that and then out into the lake. I can remember as late as 1972, when my son was still alive, we went down to visit a friend in Asheville Bay. He had bought a house that had been there for several decades, and he says, "John, what's the sewage like here?" And I says, "Well, I happen to bring some fluorescein dye along. Let's see how the sewer works for you." So I had my son Tim go into the bathroom and put a quantity of fluorescein dye in the toilet, and then I hollered, "Flush," and the toilet flushed, and then it refilled, and he flushed it a second time. And we're standing out on the shore of the lake going, 1,001, 1,002, 1,003, 1,004, and when we hit 1,030, all of a sudden this beautiful fluorescein plume appears in Asheville Bay about 70 feet off the shoreline of the lake. And that went on, that type of development consideration in tiny lots and places like that, went on uninhibited for all practical purposes until 1965, which of course is after World War II, and we'll get into that in more detail later. But this has an interesting effect. By 1934, conditions on the lake, the algal blooms on the lake are of such character that they've become concerned as a health issue, and the Chautauqua County Board of Supervisors appropriates its first money to help control the algae conditions. The unhealthy lake conditions is a term that is used. This work begins, the program has the use of 10 tons of copper sulfate towed in 100-pound bags behind the steamers. The first biological study of Chautauqua Lake is completed as part of the Allegheny-Chemung watershed in 1937 and reported out by the then New York State Conservation Department. A very interesting and intriguing book, and it gives us a great detail into the information about the lake. It tells us about fish that have already disappeared. It tells us about weed communities that, and how they are and what they are composed of. And we get a first real good write-up on Chautauqua Lake and what it is and what is happening in it. This report says people have talked about the fact that there were walleye pike in the lake, but in their investigation they couldn't find any walleye pike. They talk about the fact that the paddlefish has disappeared from the lake and several other species. They talk about the introduction of the calico bass, the black and white calicos. They talk about the introduction of other fish to the lake. They talk about needing to take the carp out of the lake. And for several years there was aggressive seining of carp. As they note, 73,000 pounds of carp taken out sometime prior to 1937. The next thing that happens that really gets the people excited is the year 32 through 36, where we have drought years and we also have a flood year. And up on the easel, I don't know if we can do a good job of showing it, but up in the corner of the easel is a record of the flooding that was published one year. And we can see, if we can catch it, we can see the challenge of well, it doesn't do too well, but we'll go over and look at it for a moment. If I don't get tangled up and drowned in this cord. In 1981, we prepared a document talking about the flooding that took place on the lake. And if you start back here, the first good comparable records start in 1913, and you'll see quite an incident of flooding to an elevation above 1310 and even above 1311. And it goes on, and as you get further and further on into more modern times, there's less and less flooding. These are important, however, because they stimulate a report to the United States Congress by the Corps of Engineers. In 1944, the Corps of Engineers submits to the 77th Congress Second Session document 685, which is a report on the conditions around Chautauqua Lake. And out of that report comes three very important recommendations: that we should widen and deepen the river from the boat landing to Warner Dam, which means there, after that constriction that I noted back in 1823 when we had a low water year in a previous presentation. The second thing is that there should be a lake regulation scheme, that aggressively we should look at the lake as a hydrological system, and we should do something about using the dam to help influence lake elevations. Now realize that we're getting more and more people living around the lake, and there's more and more leisure time. And people are beginning to be unhappy with that low summer lake elevation. Again, looking in my family's wife's archives, I find pictures of docks out into the lake back of Woodland, near the Marmar restaurant, with dry land that I have never, since I've been coming here in 1950, seen dry. The lake was still being used up and through World War II, or to World War II, as some type of a industrial water supply. The next thing that the Corps document proposed was, people don't build in the normal floodplain of the lake. Very simple. However, most of the communities around the shores of the lake before World War II didn't have any building codes or zoning ordinances or any type of building regulation. And so when somebody came to the lake and decided they'd build a cottage for the summer, and they equipped it for the summer, and maybe they used an outhouse. Oh, the good days in the outhouse. I can't help but get that dig in. I just can't live with it. I don't care for outhouses. But then all of a sudden, we began to see people that decided that because the roads had improved, hey, let's commute. And so coming up the east side of the lake and the west side of the lake, we begin to see more and more of those summer cottages become year-round places. And now they need a year-round water supply, and they need a year-round sewage disposal. There's no regulation that says how you'll get rid of your sewage. Boy, you come back to that time and time again, John. Yes, I do. In the 1930s, we had a series of public works programs, and I'm sorry, I don't remember if it was the WPA or the PWA, that funded the construction, a portion of the cost of the construction of collector systems and sewage plants for the village of Lakewood and the village of Celeron. I can tell you that Ernie Leet was deeply involved with those, and when they finally retired the last bond payment for the plant, Ernie made a big thing to do about it, because it was an important thing for the lake. There are a series of people through this period of time that are important to the lake, and I only know a few of them, but I'll mention their name. Al Bettini of the Lake Regions, Fred Cusimano, that was part of that group, Dan Lincoln and Richard Evans, who were both people that were very much involved with the Chautauqua Lake Association and its survival and its defining of its continual role. We come up later, and I'm going to mention the name now so I don't miss it at a later point, into the late 80s, when we get a fellow named Art Carlson, who's president of SOLE, Save Our Lake Environment, plays an important part. There's a whole series of people. Fred Madison, who brought the county planning process to Chautauqua County. All of these people and numbers of others that I've missed are involved and should be looked to. And of course, for Ernie Leet, we named the Celeron sewage treatment plant in his memory. And that's an interesting way to have a monument dedicated to you. But it's an exciting time. The plants of the 30s, however, we have to understand what they were. They were primary sewage treatment plants. And a primary sewage treatment plant, if it is working at 100% efficiency, settles out 65% of the solids. That means that 35% of the solids continue through the plant. It takes none of the chemistry out of the water. When they built these sewer systems, the collection systems, they didn't tell the people that they couldn't connect their storm drain, their basement drain, and their downspout drains to these sewers. So that when we would get an unusual spring freshet or an unusual spring storm, voila, the plant would end up being surcharged, it would flow at overcapacity, and the most that they would do was add additional chlorine to the material going out of the outfall. There was some settlement, but nowhere near 65% of the settlement. The plants and the lines got so surcharged that in some instances, well after World War II, manhole covers would pop off at the lower elevations and the sewage would run raw down the street and into Chautauqua Lake. In a number of instances, maintenance was deferred. I won't point to one system or the other. It's history now. And the side of a manhole next to a ditch would cave in, and that would give us the stormwater from the storm ditch into the manhole and into the sewage plant. There's a lot of that going on, and people continue to build around the shores of the lake. They continue to watch such things. Victoria Park and Midway Park were founded well before World War I, but realized that they were founded, and one of their major functions was to create traffic on the railroads going up and down each side of the lake. And of course the steamboats ran to them. The peak years for the lake railroads was 1914 to 1924, and after that we watched the Western Railroad in 1926 be closed from Mayville to Asheville, which meant the disappearance of Victoria Park. And I only know of that park as a reference point. I don't know it personally, never saw anything dealing with it. During this period of time, we had fish hatcheries at Bemis Point, Maple Springs, and then, of course, later the creation of the present fish hatchery at Prendergast. The time that we were dealing with basically is a time that, again, people are changing their lifestyle. They are changing the amount of time that they have to spend. The roads are getting better and better. If you go back to the three documents that I've referenced at earlier times, and you look at the pictures in the book on the trolleys of Chautauqua Lake, in those pictures, don't look at the trolleys. Look at the roads that the trolleys are running in. And in many instances, those trolleys, particularly up around this end of the lake, the north end of the lake, are running on rails in the middle of muddy roads that may actually have boardwalks for sidewalks on them. So as these things change, the concept of transportation changes, and we begin to realize that roads, realize that Chautauqua County government did not get into the road building business or the road responsibility business in terms of a complex system until the 1920s. So that all of the roads prior to that were town, except for the state roads. And you can have a lot of fun talking to some of the old timers about the state roads and the conditions that they were kept in. I talked with Clarence Kircher, whose dad was very much involved with Davies in the town of Ellery, and he talks about the snow plowing and the problems of coming up and down the roads. Some of the roads in Chautauqua County in those early days, one half of them would be paved. And if it was your half of the road, let's say the right side of the road was paved, and you were driving on the right side of the road and that was your side, you had the right of way. But another car coming at you who was supposed to be on the mud side could drive on the paved side until you got close enough that he then had to get off the road. Those are things that you and I don't have any memory of, and it's some of the things that people refer to as the good old days. Not so. As the development takes place around the shores of the lake, realize the following things don't exist. There's no minimum lot size that a house has to be built on. There is no minimum lot dimension upon which a house is to be built. There is no regulation as to how far apart a sewage disposal system has to be from a water well, not only on your lot, but on your neighbor's lot. And we find more and more people coming in. Of course, the other thing that starts to complicate things and make summer at Chautauqua Lake more exciting is that starting in about 1918, home appliances that we know of today and accept as absolutely there were just being provided. In the young people's vocabulary today, there's no such thing as icebox. No one even knows what an iceman is today. But there was a group of people that, of course, no one knows what a milkman is today either. And those are the types of changes, and they're all playing a role in the Chautauqua Lake. During this period of time, one of my wife's ancestors is commissioned to do a study on the construction of a bridge at Bemis Point. And there are several proposals that, just in a couple of years, we'll have a bridge across Bemis Point. But we got into a problem. You've got a steamer that has a height of what, 50 feet possibly to the top of the mast? How are you going to put a bridge across the lake? You're going to have a drawbridge? You're going to have a swinging bridge? You're going to have a bridge high enough so it doesn't impede the boat traffic. What you're looking at right now is a 1995 aerial photograph of the bridge that we do have over the lake. We have only one steamer on the lake today, but the bridge was built high enough so that that steamer could go under it. But we don't have that. We have a ferry. And the ferry takes on different roles, and you can have an awful lot of fun of looking in the Board of Supervisors records about the county finally taking it over because it's no longer economically feasible to have it run as a private enterprise. The railroad is still running up the east side of the lake, but we're getting better and better paved roads, and people are able to plan their trips in such a manner that they don't have any problem with the needing to cross the lake at the ferry. If you wanted to cross the lake at the ferry, you paid a fee based on whether or not you were on foot or horseback. It had a fee for each head of cattle that you might be taking across the lake, or your truck or your car. By this time, we're down to very, very few boats left on the lake. They basically disappear with the crash of the 1930s. It wasn't the crash that killed them. It was the automobile that put an end to the boats. The city of Jamestown, which had several names prior to its final naming as the city of Jamestown, was on the lake in January of 1950. We have a picture of that in the pamphlets. It shows them at Bemis Point. Interestingly enough, this last year I commented, so that it ended up in the paper or on radio or something, about the fact that last year the lake was open until January. Then a lady called me and said, I'm going to send you a letter. And she sent me a letter about her trip on the city of Jamestown in 1950 as a girl from the boat landing up to Bemis Point. But the city of Jamestown is the last of the big boats. And the little boats have already disappeared. 1946, we get the Gadfly 3, which sadly has disappeared since that time. But I've got to get back, keep you before World War II in this presentation. I get wandering off there every once in a while. As the railroads disappear, and as we do our biological studies, some people are beginning to understand that maybe we have a greater responsibility and a greater role that we're going to have to play and pay more attention to the lake. The Lake Association now is the keeper of the lake in these years. Things that need to be done on the lake, as an example, all of the old steamboat docks were great hazards to navigation. And they began looking at removing those hazards. They actually didn't get removed until after World War II, but they began to look at them because the old pilings were sitting up there, and if you weren't conscious of where you were or the water was high, you could tear off a shaft or tear out the bottom of a boat. If there was flooding and flotsam and jetsam material ended up on the lake, who cleaned it up? A cooperative effort between the Chautauqua Lake Association and the towns around the shores of Chautauqua Lake. But realize up to and through World War II and until 1965, none of the governments around the shores of Chautauqua Lake are concerned about the development that is taking on around the shores of the lake, except for assessment purposes. More development, more tax base. Good. The tax rate will go down. Never happens. But there is very, very little attention. Chautauqua Institution, I don't know how they financed their own sewer system. I don't know if it was done by private subscription and by the Chautauqua Utility District, or if it was a WPA project or not. I don't know. But there was some concern, and there were some people that were beginning to look at what was happening to our lake. More and more leisure time, more and more boats of various descriptions. We end up hosting some very interesting sailing regattas and races during this period of time that draw national attention. And I won't go into those details. I would refer you to the 3 documents that I've mentioned before, the 3 publications by the Fenton Historical Society that are available from the Fenton Historical Society in Jamestown, which are the steamboats, the hotels, and the trolleys of Chautauqua Lake. I recommend them to you highly. We have another document out dealing with Mayville by Devin Taylor. We also have a publication out titled The Great White Fleet, and I'm sorry I don't remember who the author of that is, but I recommend them to you. I also recommend that you read, if you're a real historic buff, that you read Hazeltine's history of the town of Ellicott, because that tells us an awful lot about what is happening on Chautauqua Lake and at the outlet of Chautauqua Lake prior to the time that we've just talked about. I think I've run out of gas and run out of information, so I ask you to, again, come back and listen again as we talk about our lake, your lake and my lake.